Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to this week's edition of the Wednesday webinars. I am excited. This is Tristan Hightower. I'm the operations manager for the IGDA. I'm excited to introduce Caryn Vainio. I totally messed it up. She is a UX designer at Z2 in Seattle, and she's going to talk about being a mother in the game industry. Caryn?
Hi guys, as Tristan said, my name is Caryn Vainio and I am a user experience designer in mobile games. I work for Z2. If you've ever played our games, Battle Nations or Metal Storm Aces, you've played one of our games. And I have been in the game industry for about 15 years now, getting my start at GameSpy out in California really early on, running a site called Planet Quake and then gradually moving into a career in UI design, and then eventually shifting into a career as a user experience designer. So that's what I do now. So I've been working for about 10 years as an actual game developer with 5 years of experience prior to that working with publishers in game development. And I've been a mom for about 3 years now. I have a 3-year-old son. Well, he'll be 3 next month. And my husband also works in the game industry. So we're a game industry couple. And one of the reasons why this webinar exists is because as a mom in game dev, I've been looking for people to talk to about motherhood in the game industry. And I found that I could find very few women who were actually working in the game industry as mothers. So I started investigating. It turns out that I found some women online who I didn't even know were moms in the game industry, and it sort of cascaded from there. And so it suddenly occurred to me that this is a topic that people don't really talk about a lot. We talk a lot about women in the industry, and how we're constantly trying to get more women into the industry, make the game industry a friendly place for women to work. And that's obviously been improving a little bit, but we still have some things that we can do. And the more I go through my career as a mom, the more I realize that one of those barriers that we have to overcome still is motherhood. Because even though we're continuing to make the industry a better place for women to work in general, when it comes to motherhood, it's a barrier. Women talk about leaving the industry before they have children, or they're even choosing not to start families specifically because they feel that the game industry is just not a career that's conducive to motherhood. So that's a thing I think that really we should talk about. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about kind of how I went about this topic. Oh, and before I forget, I want to make sure that if you have questions, feel free to throw them into the questions panel in your webinar interface, and I'll get to them at the end. And we'll just go back to those. So why I want to talk about this topic and why it's kind of a thing I'm very interested in is because when my husband and I were having our son, I was seeking out a lot of advice about how to manage a career that is conducive to stress and conducive to overtime when you have a child, because I thought, hey, that's just a hard thing. How do people deal with this? And I found, because I was working in a mostly male-dominated industry, that whenever I would talk to other women, other female game developers, they rarely had kids, so I couldn't get advice from them. And when I talked to guys that I worked with, I couldn't really relate to them because many of the guys I work with had different experiences as a father in the game industry. And so I started posting a lot online about being a mom in game dev and how difficult it is to manage things like crunch. And pretty soon, I found that there were women who were responding to my tweets or on Facebook who were saying, yeah, I have a kid and it's really hard. And I'm like, wait, whoa, you have a kid? Like, I had no idea that there were women I knew working in the game industry that I knew or on social media who had children. And as I talked to them about it, they revealed that they actually found it really uncomfortable to talk about being a mother in the game industry because there is a perception that being a mother means that you are less dedicated as a game developer. And I found that really disheartening. The common thing that I met with when I talked to women about this, like, why don't you talk about motherhood more? Why do I never see that from you? They often talk about, well, it feels weird to talk about because I feel like I won't be taken seriously. And I think that that's a really serious issue. It was the reason why I was kind of feeling alone as a game dev mom, because I kind of felt like just alone on an island. I'm in a high-stress career. lots of crunch, lots of overtime, and I felt like I had no one to talk to about how do other people manage this while being a parent. And I feel like if we talk about this more and we remove that discomfort that women in the game industry feel about talking about being a parent, it will help people like me who felt like I was alone and had no one to seek advice from. So yeah, touching on my own experience with this, when I had my son, you can see him peeking back there. If you're looking at the webinar, that's a picture of my son when he was just I think about a year old. When I had my son, I was working at Uber Entertainment, which is a great company. We were small at the time. I think we were only about 20 people. I was the only woman working there. It just happened to be that way. Really, really loved working there. Still love the company. Still love the people who are there. It was one of my best gaming experiences in the industry. But what was fascinating about it is at the same time as I loved working there, becoming a parent while working there was a hugely stressful thing after I had my son. And the reason why is because, like I said, I had all male coworkers, and many of them were fathers, which was awesome. That was a really great experience because the company was extremely supportive of me becoming a mother. That was really fantastic. The owners all have kids. The directors all have kids. And it was, what was really great was that when I told them I was really nervous about telling them that I was going to be a parent, because I thought to myself, will their perceptions about me change when I tell them, hey, I'm going to have a baby and I'm going to take some maternity leave? How will that affect my standing in the company? And this was in a company where I felt really comfortable with people. So I can only imagine how women feel when they don't work at a really tight-knit company where they feel well supported. So I told my boss and the directors about becoming a mom, and they were super excited. The first thing they said to me was, when I started telling them about planning my leave and figuring out how I was going to handle all that, they said, hey, you don't have to think about that right now. This is just a cool thing. You're going to be a mom. This is awesome. We'll just work it out. Don't worry about it. So that was really great. But what was interesting, though, is that as I went through pregnancy, obviously my male coworkers couldn't relate because they were all men. But even when I approached them about just how do you plan to work while having a child, because I did plan to come back. I always planned to come back because I love what I do, and I knew I wanted to take a few months off to spend with my son, and then I wanted to come back into game development and come back to the company I was working for. When I would talk to them about this, it was a big cultural difference, because almost universally whenever I talked to men in the industry, their response was, well, I'm not sure what to tell you for advice because my wife stays at home with our kids, which is really common, I found, and I think that's great. But for me, I found that it was something I couldn't relate to. I couldn't find anyone who worked in the game industry raising a small child who was a woman, and so I thought that was really interesting. The other thing that I ran into as a mother, once I actually had my son, about when my son was a little bit less than a year old, I left Uber and I was looking at companies here in Seattle, and I started looking. Some of the mobile companies were specifically looking for user experience designers, so I was talking a lot with mobile companies. And as you probably know, mobile companies frequently talk about catering to the quote 40-year-old mom demographic. At the time that I was looking, I was a 40-year-old mom. I had my son at about 38 years old, so I was an older mom. And so every time I would run into this sort of stereotypical persona that we have, this 40-year-old mom thing, it always sounded derisive. It just sounded like people really hated the topic of a 40-year-old mom. Well, it's a thing that 40-year-old moms play. This is a game for 40-year-old moms. And it always struck me as we have this kind of disdain for the 40-year-old mom concept, and it really bothered me because, first of all, I'm a 40-year-old mom. I play games. I have fun. I have a career. I mean, I felt like, hey, I'm a 40-year-old mom, and I don't fit this strange stereotype in your head of whatever a 40-year-old mom is. And that stereotype is compounded when you're a woman in the game industry looking to continue your career in games, and people are talking about you as a 40-year-old mom as if you're this weird, distant person that nobody knows, that isn't real. You're just sort of this person off in the distance that plays these games, and they're not really a gamer. So I ran into that a lot, and I kind of it's kind of become a bit of a side project for me to break down this whole 40-year-old mom concept, because every 40-year-old mom I know is pretty cool. And they work hard, and they're fun, and I don't know who this other 40-year-old mom is that the game industry has in their head as a persona, and I think if more women in the game industry and in tech in general talk about their experiences being a mother, I think it would be a great thing to help break down that strange concept that we have. So the other experience I wanted to mention from my own personal experiences, of course, crunch time, everyone's experienced it, and I knew I was going to be experiencing it differently as a mom for the first time. And as I said, I was working at Uber Entertainment, and because we were a small group and we were releasing updates to our game on a really, really tight schedule, about every week or 2 weeks, we were releasing these updates. And I remember at one point, I came back to my job about 4.5 months after my son was born. My son went into daycare, and my husband also worked in the game industry, so our son was in a daycare about 15 minutes away from where I worked. And I was also a nursing mom, so I had to do a whole schedule around my pumping and around going to nurse him at lunchtime in order to make sure that I could continue to nurse him for as long as I wanted. And so that was stressful alone. Then you add crunch into it, and it just adds a whole layer of hell to it. And it was probably the most stressful time of my life. My son was, I think, about 6 to 9 months old when we were really in our heavy crunch period. He was only just starting to eat, I think, solid foods. And I remember distinctly having times during the week when my husband would bring our son to work, to my work, and we would grab some takeout, and he would entertain my son, and I would go and nurse him in an empty office. And we were small, so I had to go borrow someone's office. Where I would nurse him in an empty office, go back to my desk, make a check-in, cook some content on the Xbox 360, go and nurse him some more. And then I remember, and this was really stressful, and you know, it'd be 9 o'clock at night before we get home, and my son's schedule is completely off because he's just kind of, you know, been hanging out in this office, this noisy office. And so I have this distinct memory of one night working late, and my son I had nursed him, I'd fed him, we'd gotten takeout, I'm making this check-in, and I'm realizing that at 9 o'clock at night, I'm not going to be able to get done what I need to in order to make this update happen. I would have had to have stayed for at least a couple more hours. And I'm standing there, and I've got literally my husband with my son in one hand, and he's cranky, and he's crying, he wants to go home, and my boss on the other, and they are both looking at me. It was a literal moment of my personal life on one side as a mother and my career on the other side, both looking at me going, well, I guess you're going to make a decision as to which is more important. And I really felt horrible because I felt like I was a terrible mother for bringing my son to work and making him have to stay up and having to try and fit this nursing and feeding in between work. And then I was a terrible employee because I wasn't getting my work done because I had to deal with family. And so that was really, really difficult. And I have not had that experience since. And I certainly think it's not an experience that anyone at Uber wanted us to have. It was just the nature of the game industry. But I think it illustrates really well that as an industry, even though we've grown up and more of our employees are having kids, it does feel like we still aren't quite there in terms of supporting people who have at least young children, and especially young children, but kids in general. So I talked to a lot of women who are mothers, and I was utterly shocked at some of the things that women have been told about having kids, whether they have kids or having them. These are actual things that women have been told. There is a lovely lady who's written a nice blog article about being a mother, Ember Dion on Twitter, and she talked about how when she leaves to go pick up her kid from daycare, she's heard people say things like, well, I wish I had kids so I could leave early like her, which is really unfortunate. Another woman talked in an article about how when she was interviewing for jobs, she was asked if she plans on having babies, which I believe is a thing they're not supposed to ask you, but she was asked, and when she said no, they said, well, that's good. You women tend to go off and have babies. These are things that shouldn't be said to anyone. These are things that we have to change. These are things that we have to change in our workplace. We need to change the perception that parents, whether it's men or women, but parents who go home to take care of family matters are somehow slacking off and not pulling their own weight. And then the second quote, you women tend to go off and have babies, is significant because women already face a bias in this industry that we've been working really hard over the last few years to overcome. This erases all of that. We need to get out of this mindset that you can be a woman in the game industry or you can go off and have a baby, but you cannot do both. So I want to talk about a survey that I took. When I was thinking about this topic, I had a lot of questions in my head. And I thought, hey, I really want to know more about these questions I have. So I put together a SurveyMonkey survey. And I'm not going to lie, I'm not a professional survey crafter, and I don't know how scientific this is, but I put together about 20 questions that I wanted both men and women to answer. I wanted people to be able to answer it whether they have kids or whether they might be thinking of having kids. And I wanted people to be able to answer it whether they were in the game industry or not in the game industry so that I could compare and contrast the responses. So I got about 257 people responding. And I got men and women both in the game industry and outside of it. And the survey results were absolutely fascinating to me. Some of them were things I just didn't really expect. So I want to talk to you guys about that because I think some of the answers are really telling. So the good news, there were some interesting things that came out of my little survey that I certainly didn't expect, that I thought were kind of pointing toward progress in the industry. And one of those was that the majority of both genders, men and women, felt that their individual employer was very supportive of people with families, even though they felt that the game industry as a whole is moderately unsupported. So I had two questions. I had, do you feel that your employer is supportive of employees with families? And that means things like understanding that your schedule has to revolve around things like daycare pickup, understanding that not everybody can crunch the same way if you have kids. And then the second question was, do you feel that the game industry as a whole is supportive of employees with families? I thought it was very telling that people feel that their individual employer is great, but they perceive the game industry as a whole to be fairly unsupportive. So I think that suggests that we must be doing something right on an individual level, and that maybe the game industry isn't quite as unfriendly to family life as we think it is, because individual employers do seem to be doing individual things to make life good. In general, I was actually surprised to find that both genders equally felt that their quality of life has stayed roughly the same. So not much has changed in that regard, declined or improved. Both genders, surprising to me, felt that their employers treated both mothers and fathers equally in terms of support. So which I found really interesting because of another question in the survey that's actually different. But they generally felt that their employers were fairly treating moms and dads who had to, say, take PTO or take time off for sick kids or leave early because of childcare issues. But there are some other questions that were really fascinating to me that I think were really telling about motherhood and parenthood in general in the industry, but specifically motherhood. So coworkers' perceptions. This is probably the most interesting result I got out of the survey. The question is, did you feel that your coworkers judged you differently after becoming a parent? Roughly 64 or 65% of men said no. And going along with that, it turns out that women who don't work in the game industry also felt that way. About 57 to 60% said that no, they did not feel judged differently. However, women in the game industry, 64% of them feel that their coworkers judge them differently after becoming a parent. This is fascinating to me because it contrasts with women's experiences outside of the game industry. It's clear that in the game industry, women feel like there is definitely a different perception about women as moms in the game industry than there are from men as fathers. And I think that's a really big deal, and it contributes. And what contributes to that is the quotes that I mentioned before, where people say, "Oh, I wish that I could leave early because I had kids," and I hear from a lot of women who feel that they feel that people are saying stuff like they're not pulling their own weight, they're leaving early. The perception is that she's not there. That perception does not seem to exist when men are parents in the industry. When guys have to take extra time because of sick kids, it doesn't seem to have as big an impact as when women do. So women tend to feel at least that they are perceived differently as a parent. Taking leave and coming back, I found this to be really interesting as well. So I asked the question about how much time you took before going back to work. And women who weren't in the game industry, you can see that there's sort of a rough distribution of when they went back, but a good percentage of them went back within the first 2 to 4 months of having a kid. And 85% of them went back to work for the same company that they were working for before they had a kid. But women in the game industry, on the other hand, a much bigger chunk of them took only a 2-month or less leave after having a kid, and yet 60% of them, only 60% of them, went back to the work at the same company that they were working for. And I don't know why this is. Women game developers seem to take a shorter maternity leave than their non-industry counterparts, but their non-industry counterparts tend to go back to work for the same employer in larger numbers. So why do game dev moms go back to work more quickly but not for the same companies? I have no idea what the answer is to that. I have some ideas, like I wonder, are the jobs still there for them? Do they decide that their employer isn't going to be supportive of them as a mother? I have no idea what the answers are, but it's something I kind of want to follow up on because I thought it was really interesting. And it might say something about, finding the answer to that might say something about what we can do to improve sort of life for parents, but specifically working moms in game development. So nursing, across the board, we can do better than that. Pretty much every industry, not just games, can do better than that. I was a nursing mom. A lot more moms are nursing these days. And nursing support is atrocious pretty much everywhere, but it's particularly not that great in the game industry. I had a lot of individual responses to my survey. At the end of the survey, I asked people what we could do better, and they were free to put in their own thoughts. And a lot of, it seemed to me like a lot of the responses were from nursing moms who said that they just felt like there was no support for them to pump. They didn't have a place where they could pump. If they did have a place where they could pump, it was a dirty utility closet. And so it seems like we could do a lot better for this. Again, this is true regardless of industry. Both women in the game industry and women outside of it reported that they felt somewhat, they felt that there were some things that could be done better. One of the things I want to talk about is motherhood as an asset. I think we tend to think of motherhood as a liability for a lot of women. Oh, she's going to quit her job, or oh, we're going to lose her to a maternity leave. But I think that there's an upside to being a mom that we should look at, and we don't look at it often enough. For instance, time management. If you're a mom listening to this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Mothers are expert time managers. We know how to make the best use of 15 minutes of time. Before I was a parent, contrasted with when I became a parent, once I had a son, I said to myself, man, I can't believe I wasn't out curing cancer and running marathons before I had a kid, because I could have done all of those simultaneously, I feel like. Whereas now, I know that like 2 nights a week, I have maybe an hour to myself, and I literally plan that ahead of time. I think, what am I going to do with my spare hour of time? I know how to use 15 minutes of time. I can get laundry and dishes done in 15 minutes of time. And as you can see, if you're watching the webinar, there's a picture there where I am shearing alpacas with my 9-month-old son. We have to be creative about how to do things and how to get things done and how to allow life to go on when we have a child to care for. I own alpacas, and every year we have to shear them. And the first year that I had my son, I thought, oh my God, how are we going to do this? I have no idea how I'm going to manage having to spend an entire day on a farm with no real good place to nurse and no good place to put him where he can play. So we did what we knew what to do. We just put him on my back, and he happily spent time while we sheared our alpacas and spent the day at the farm working. So obviously other people have done that since time immemorial, but for modern mothers, it's a little bit different, I think. So yeah, mothers are expert time managers. That is something that I think people don't utilize enough. Another thing I think we don't think about is motherhood as a life experience and something that contributes to your character development as a person. In our society, we talk a lot about fatherhood as a growth in character, or even as a lack of growth in character, but at all times we sort of consider fatherhood as a life-changing event that men go through that changes them in interesting ways. And I think we can all think of movies and books and even games that have been made by men who have experienced a profound change of outlook in their lives by having children. That's something that we never seem to acknowledge about mothers. And I think that that's a shame. And I think the reason why we do this, and this is me completely armchair psychology, I'm not a psychologist, I don't know what I'm talking about, but my speculation is, as a layman, that we, as a society, we tend to view all women as inherently mothers, even if we're not mothers, and therefore becoming a mother is simply the sort of natural next step of our lives. There's nothing interesting about it to people. But if you're a mom, and you're in the audience and you're listening to this, you know probably as well as I do that motherhood is a profoundly life-changing experience. I became a completely different kind of person. I mean, obviously I stayed the same essentially as a person, but so much of my character growth happened becoming a mother. And that's a profound thing. And as game developers, we're in a unique position to utilize that in our storytelling and our experience in making games. If any of you know who Brenda Romero is, she did a very interesting TED Talk about some games that she's making. She has children herself, and she has a daughter who is both Caucasian and African American. And so her father is African American, and she was learning about a historical event that I'm sorry I don't have written down, but it was basically a ship full of African slaves, and it was a torturous journey. And in order to help her daughter understand this, she actually made a game about it for her. And they learned so much. And if you watch the TED Talk, Brenda Romero cries a little bit when she tells the story, because for her, this is a profoundly personal thing, that she has a daughter whose ancestors had to experience this journey. And so for her to see that and to be able to tell her about that through the power of games, that's an amazing thing. And her connection as a mother is what made that happen. And I think that we don't do enough to acknowledge that those are profoundly interesting things. So what can we do to improve? There's a lot that we can do to improve. At the end of my survey, I talked to people about what if they could pick 3 things that we could improve about the industry, what would they be? And I asked both men and women, and all of these answers are anonymous. I don't know who said them, but I thought that I picked a few that I felt were particularly interesting. The common request by both genders, of course, more paid maternity and paternity leave so the parents aren't taking vacation time at PTO to have kids. That was across the board. Men and women both felt that they just don't get enough time. And I think more companies are doing a better job of this. I know that when we had our son, my husband, again, who's a game developer, his company said, hey, take as much time as you want. We can only give you so much of that paid. But you know, it's not. He wasn't pressured to just take a week or 2. He was told, take as much time as you feel you need, and we're here when you come back, which I thought was really great. And my company as well, at the time at Uber Entertainment, that was they did the same thing. They said, how much leave do you want to take? And me being nervous about it, I said, well, how much time can I have? They said, how much time do you want? And I said, I want to take 4 months and then gradually come back in over the 5th month. And they said, no problem. And they gave me more paid leave than they were required to, which was really fantastic. Another thing that, of course, is a common request is more flexible hours in PTO. People who don't have kids don't seem to understand that daycare closes at 6. So I've heard of companies in the game industry who say, yeah, our core hours are like 10 to 6 p.m. Well, I'm sorry, but I can't be there till 6 p.m. My daycare closes. So I have to pick up my son. These are, of course, issues for parents across the board, men and women. We need to be able to adjust our schedules according to our kids' schooling and daycare requirements. So these are some interesting quotes I thought that came out of the survey. And one of these was, at the company I worked for, which I left shortly after returning from maternity leave, it was all about an attitude by upper management. Maybe management should have to do sensitivity training around workers who are mothers. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, because we do, of course, have sensitivity training in the workplace to deal with the fact that, hey, we have a little bit more gender diversity now in the workplace. and also sexual preference diversity, and so we have to do sensitivity training about that. It might be a good idea to have management training around the, dealing with employees who are parents and around mothers. It would be like that quote that I mentioned earlier by the woman who was interviewing, where they said, "You women tend to go off and have babies." That's a thing that should never, ever be said to a woman interviewing in the game industry. That you can't, having that bias against women who are mothers is really unfortunate, and we should maybe do some training to help eradicate that. Here's another quote: "Stop assuming mothers are less ambitious. 2, fight the focus on FaceTime. 3, realize the value good management practices can provide in ensuring people don't have to work insane hours to get a lot of good work done." So we've all experienced crunch in the game industry. It's pretty common. And yeah, crunch is hard on everybody, but it's particularly hard on parents. I had read a story, and I think everybody's experienced this if you have worked at a company where there's fathers. I read a story of a woman who said that she had seen, of course, a father at crunch time late at night using Skype to talk to his kids before bed, and someone said, "Oh, you know, what a great dad you're able to do that." And he said, "You know, if I was such a great father, I'd be home putting him to bed." And so mothers feel that too. And obviously, mothers feel a bit more pressure in the game industry based on that survey question that says that they feel that their coworkers judge them differently. So it's the amount of pressure that we feel is pretty insane to be both good mothers and good employees. So it would be valuable to try and reduce some of that pressure. Consider becoming part of the babiesatwork.org program and or offering on-site daycare for parents of infants to spend bonding time during work days. Extending parental leave. I know a guy at Square who had 6 months paternity leave. That's great. The Babies at Work program sounds awesome. On-site daycare, boy, I'd be all about that. I've discussed this with some people in the last couple of days, and they had a really good discussion. And of course, there's a lot of liability issues for companies having on-site daycare. But boy, if we could make that work, it would be so great. My experience when I was at Uber was my daycare for my son was about 15 minutes down the road in good traffic. And if you're in Seattle, you know how bad traffic is. It's never good. And because I was nursing, I was having difficulty pumping enough milk for him. I just was a mom who just couldn't do that very well. So my best bet was to simply nurse him rather than pump. So I had a strange schedule where I would, at lunch, I would get in the car and I'd run down to daycare and I would nurse him at lunch, and then I'd come back and I'd literally be pumping on the way back in the car, and then I would, of course, have to have 2 other pumping sessions at work. That's extremely difficult. That was the most stressful period of my life ever. And I felt like, of course, a guilty mom for having my baby in daycare already. So add to that the guilt I was feeling as I was walking out the door to go nurse him when I should have been at work. That was really, really difficult. And if there was, but yet I've heard of some women, not in the game industry, who work in buildings where there are daycare facilities, and they would get a phone call from the daycare that says, "Hey, your baby's ready to eat," and they would simply come downstairs, nurse them, and go right back upstairs to work. And that would be so ideal. It is obviously an ideal, and it's very difficult to make that happen, but it would be great if there was some way that we could make that happen. Given that so many children play our games, parents have unique insight into what and how kids play. Understanding their kids, while still not being one of them, a study on the impact of this view in game design and development would be awesome and could provide an opening for a long-term discussion about parenting in the games industry. That kind of goes along with my point about parenthood being an asset and how we need to show that parenthood is an asset for both fathers and mothers. As parents, exactly what this survey taker said, we have a unique insight into what and how kids play. It's fascinating. Just having a child has made a dramatic difference in my job as a user experience designer. I get to watch a tiny little human who's learning how to interact with things in their world, and I get to watch how they perceive interaction in their world. I watched my son one day pick up a toy that had a thing on it, and he pressed it because it looked like a button, and it was not a button, and I thought, how fascinating is that? my entire work revolves around that. And I get to watch this tiny little human learn all about that for the first time. It's like having a UX laboratory or a user lab right in my house, and it's absolutely fascinating. And that's an asset. That's not a liability. That's a thing that adds to my work. This is my favorite quote, and it's the last one in my presentation, and I felt it was an incredibly good point to end on. I don't know who said this, but if you're listening, thank you for this quote, because this was absolutely distilled everything about my talk into one nice statement. Industry, realize that working moms, all working parents, are probably organized as all get out and are more of an asset than the liability you treat them as. They just might need to work flexible hours. If we're still opting into this industry after all we've been through in the extremely scant return, don't you dare question our commitment. I thought that that was really, really revealing. That was really great. Women are opting into an industry that already has a bias against them. And when we stick it out, you should not consider us as being less committed because we're having a child. When I came back to work in the game industry, I could have taken my career elsewhere. User experience designers are in demand at other companies. I did not have to come back to the game industry. I came back to the game industry because I love making games. If I'm still opting into an industry that still tends to have a bias against women, that means I'm very, very committed. We need to treat women who decide to become moms not as a liability but as an asset. They have a lot to bring to the table, and I think that we don't do enough to recognize that fact. So thanks very much. That was great, and I just want to take a look at some of the questions, it looks like, that we have in our panel and answer some stuff. So let's take a look here. So we've got, let me see here. So we've got a question from Deborah Sayez here. So let me take a look at the, oh, it looks like she's got something to share here. So it was an intern for a game company. During my internship, they had decided to hire someone to join their team. I was there for all the interviews and saw all potential candidates. Out of all of them, there was one that stood out. She was a female and had great credentials, ex-EA person, did some really amazing games. When the company was having a meeting on who to hire, she was there in person. She was the one they wanted the most, but they had an issue. She had a wedding ring, and she was in her early 30s. They literally said that since she was married, she was soon going to have a kid and that it would pose a problem. Other than this issue, she was perfect, and we're agitated that this was the circumstance. So they hired a young guy with much less experience. See, that's just absolutely disheartening. You can't, first of all, in this day and age, you can't make assumptions about who's going to have kids and who doesn't, because who knows? There are so many people choosing not to have kids. But even without that, I think it's not even legal for you to do that. Potentially, I'd have to look into that, but it's really unfortunate that they chose to do that. And when people, I think sometimes men raise their eyebrows when women say, "Hey, we experience these issues in the game industry." This happens, folks. People don't get hired. Women don't get hired because of this issue. We have to stop that. That's not right. Deborah goes on to ask, what would you recommend for women who are trying to change jobs or get jobs in the industry that are having this problem? Well, what I would recommend is that, unfortunately, anything that I can recommend really depends on the outlook of the employers that you're looking to work at. If there are, I mean, obviously the woman that Deborah describes had no control over the hiring decision. She would have had no idea that they looked and saw a wedding ring on her finger and that she was in her early 30s and would have a kid. She would have no idea that they guessed that. So when they turn her down for the job, how is she going to know that that's what they're turning her down for? What I'm recommending is that we work in this industry to change that mindset. If you're a woman in the game industry and you're a mom in the game industry, I know that women talk about how they don't want to talk about their kids. They don't want to. They're nervous about people's perceptions changing if they talk a lot about their kids. But I honestly feel like we need to make sure that people know that there are moms in game development working and that we're doing just fine and that we're not a liability, we're an asset. That's unfortunately the best thing I can recommend. The other thing I can recommend is that I mean, you basically put your best foot forward in an interview and hope that they don't notice that, because it's like I said, she would have had absolutely no idea that that was the case, that was why they turned her down. So that was the only question we had. So thank you very much for that. It's a little bit shorter than I anticipated, but I really appreciate you guys taking the time, and thank you very much.
Hey, Caryn, there's a couple of last questions popping in. I don't know if you want to grab those or not.
Oh, yeah, sure. Am I still on?
Yes, you are.
Great. Where are the questions? I don't see them.
The question box, do you still have that open?
Oh, there they are. Never mind, sorry. All right, here's another question from Cody Barrow. As a white male in the game industry, I've observed this sort of sexism at multiple companies. Are there any rights agencies I can cite to help stand up against that? I wish I had a good answer for you, but I am not a legalese person. I don't know what legal stuff that you can actually, like what actual codes you can tell them. But I mean, we all kind of know that that the stuff is not right. So the best thing you can do is you can point it out to people. If in the question that Deborah posed, or in the scenario that Deborah talked about with the woman getting hired, if there were any men in that room who thought to them, or anyone in that room, women or men, if anybody in that room heard them saying that, they absolutely should have spoken up. If I were in an interview situation and someone said, well, we can't hire her, she's going to have a baby, you cannot imagine how livid I would be. And I would be saying something about it, because that's not right. I know that, I mean, really in general, whether it's sexism in general or sexism against women who are going to be potential mothers or women who are mothers, the issue is always the same. Always speak up. I know someone who, a man working in the game industry, who had there was a young guy working, who noticed that a woman had gotten hired there, and the first thing he said was, hey, I got dibs. And this guy that I know turned to him and said, no, you can't do that. That's wrong. You cannot do that. Adults don't do that. This is an industry where we have to make sure that kind of stuff, you know, that's the bad perception of the game industry. Don't contribute to that. By standing up against that stuff and actually saying something, you have to actually say something. You can't think it. You have to say it. You help reduce some. You may have been able to say to those guys, hey, you can't do this, and they might have thought, well, okay, or present arguments for why this woman is still the best candidate. So another question from Susan Sherman: does the industry recognize the increasing number of moms who turn to games for a few minutes of relaxation? They do as a customer. We just don't as game developers. Again, it's that 40-year-old mom perception. You'll hear that phrase used a lot. It's the 40-year-old mom game. That was the a few years ago when Facebook games were all the rage. That was the only 40-year-old moms played Facebook games. So that is a demographic that the game industry realizes as a customer, but we don't realize that as a game developer. And there are lots of the crazy thing about that is that women that I know who, and of course I'm biased because I'm in the game industry, and I'm also a gamer. I've been playing Quake since the 90s. I've been playing all versions of Quake, Call of Duty, Battlefield, all of that. So I've been a hardcore gamer for a while, so my perception's a bit skewed in that regard. But women are gamers, and just because a woman's playing a few minutes of Candy Crush on the bus doesn't mean that she's not also interested in a game that's not Candy Crush, in a game with more depth. So we have to stop. That's where the 40-year-old mom perception comes in. We have to stop thinking of this whole 40-year-old mom as this weird persona that is just, oh, they just sit down and play a Facebook game for a few minutes. Yes, there are those people that exist, but guess what? It's not just moms. It's men who do it too. So yeah, we need to recognize that. Another question. Let's see. Yeah, if so, moms in the industry become golden assets. Absolutely. Susan is right. If we recognize that not just moms, but people in general like to play these sort of casual games for a few minutes on the bus, then that's experience that we can use, whether it's a mom or not a mom. So yeah, that's great. All right, I think that's all the questions. Maybe Tristan can take over. Yeah, thanks very much, you guys. I think that's all the questions, and Thanks to the IGDA for having me talk, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.